Greetings ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to my Total War Warhammer Ostermark lore video. And today we are going to be looking at the province of Ostermark in the east of the Empire. As many of you who aren't new to the channel may know, I've done a series of these. If you'd like to see some of the other provinces I've covered, do click on the top right hand corner popping up now, or do check the description for a link to the playlist on my other Empire provinces, and I've done some of the Bretonnian dukedoms as well. But for today we are focusing on the province of Ostermark. Now, Ostermark was historically ruled by the people known as the Ostrogoths in the time before Sigmar. Now, the Ostrogoths lived in fortified villages in this part of the world, and they'd long been the victims of greenskin invasions and troll raids and all kinds of nefarious things trying to hunt and kill them. As a result, they built up a series of fortified villages and were very cooperative with one another in terms of the security of Ostermark itself. So long ago, they learnt the value of cooperation. So when Sigmar came calling, asking them to join his great coalition of human tribes to fight off the greenskin hordes, they were there with hats on. They were like, okay, let's do this. We completely understand the value of cooperation. Let's try and secure these borders for humanity. So their leader at the time, who was a chap called Adelhard, put together a mighty force of axemen, and they joined Sigmar on his march south towards Blackfire Pass and the eventual war with the Greenskins down there. Eventually, of course, Sigmar was victorious, and he's said to have gone and approached Adelhard and said, "My old friend, we've won." And Adelhard said to have said, "Our victory was foreseen in the stars." And that's said to have played a role in the design of the heraldry of Ostermark. Now, the heraldry, old heraldry of Ostermark can be seen in the bottom right-hand corner here, and it is supposedly a crowned griffin, and there's a mention in the lore of the star being present in terms of Adelhard saying it was foreseen in the stars. However, I haven't seen any Ostermark heraldry with a star on it. Let me know if you guys have in the comments below, but I haven't. But it's said in the lore that it's meant to tie into the heraldry. Maybe the crown is meant to be star-shaped. I'm not 100% sure on that. But that's where the old heraldry of Ostermark comes from. It's meant to be the victorious griffin, they call it. Now, I have seen in other places it described as the victorious red manticore, but I'm going to stick with the griffin line on this one. So Adelhard and his troops marched back up south to their land into what would become Ostermark and his newly created position of Elector Count. On his march up north, Adelhard and his soldiers collected wives and mistresses from Averland, from Sturland, from Talabecland, and they essentially just resulted in a huge mixing of the bloodlines in what the people of Ostermark would later become. This was added to when, during the 18th century of the imperial calendar, the Ungals, who are kind of like the Warhammer version of the Mongols, invaded the eastern part of the empire, and there was an even further mixing of the bloodlines then. And not to mention Ostermark's proximity to Kislev, and the cross-border marriages that frequently occurred, mixing in some Kislevite blood as well to the hodgepodge of what makes up the Osterlander sort of heritage, shall we say. The Ostermarkers tend not to put too much credence in bloodlines and heritage and things like that. It's not something that tends to pop up a lot in their histories or in terms of what they value. They acknowledge that there are parts of them from all these different peoples, from throughout the empire and from even further than that. But they're kind of happy with it, and no one really there's not a big tradition of tracking one's heraldry to prove that one is a true Ostrogoth, so they just kind of roll with the punches. The culture in Ostermark, though, is still, however, undeniably imperial and ties into all things that the Empire stands for, and they're obviously very loyal to the Empire and dedicated to the ideals the Empire holds. In terms of the government of Ostermark, it's run very much like a miniature empire. The Elector Count himself is said to have said, "Ostermark is like a miniature empire, a league of free and independent towns relying on each other for security." And on top of this, the individual towns in Ostermark each have someone called a Margrave, who's kind of like the Empire's equivalent of an Elector Count. And although the title of Chancellor of the League of Ostermark is an inherited one among the Hertvigs these days, the rest of the Margraves can hold a council where they can, I believe, skip over an heir apparent and maybe pick somebody else within the family to take over the role of Chancellor. And they kind of have that veto power. So it's kind of up to them who they want in the Hertvig family to be the Chancellor of the League of Ostermark, stroke the Elector Count of Ostermark itself. So it's quite unique in the way it's governed that way. In terms of Ostermark's geography, it's kind of divided into 4 main areas. Up in the north, you have the branch of the Great Wood, which in Ostermark is called the Griffin Wood, and this has long been the center of political power in Ostermark, at least since the collapse of the old capital of Mordheim in the south. It's also the capital of Ostermark's primary export, which is lumber and the construction of riverboats, said to be the finest riverboats in the entirety of the empire. Now, moving to the south, the other wooded area in Ostermark is known as the Deadwood, and that encapsulates the area around the old capital of Mordheim. And we'll get into the details of Mordheim a little bit later in this video, but the Deadwood is a mysterious and dangerous place. It's said that screams emanate from within it late at night, and anyone who ventures in tends to leave mad or mutated. And often creatures from the Deadwood will burst out and raid and attack the surrounding towns. The next area we'll look at is the area between these 2 woods, south of the river Brunwasser. And that is the Bleak Moors, kind of low rolling hills with shallow lakes and kind of a near constant fog perpetuating over the area. It's a very sparsely populated area and isn't really ideal for farming, although it does make some okay grazing land for sheep and a few dairy cattle farms as well. To the south of the Bleak Moors, is by the border with Sylvania, is the area known as the Erie Downs. Now, the Erie Downs is said to be the site of an ancient battle between Ostermark and the vampire counts, whereby the bodies of the dead Ostermarkers were risen up, but their souls remained in place in the Erie Downs and can be seen as floating lights that still wander the area at night. It's said these floating lights will try and trick passers-by, luring them to their deaths, so that these souls can take over the bodies of those who have died. Now, there may be some truth in this, in that I'm sure that the Erie Downs on the border of Sylvania has had its experiences with the risen dead, but whether it's actually the souls of these ancient warriors looking for new bodies to inhabit hasn't been proven one way or another. Moving on from the Bleak Moors and the Erie Downs, we have the Veld. And the Veld is a very grassy plains area where a lot of horse rearing happens, and, just a lot of horse riding and horse racing occurs in this area of Ostermark. This is very much under the influence of the Ungles, who came and moved into the part of Ostermark and really brought with them their knowledge of horse racing and horse breeding. And that's often what goes on in this part of the province. In terms of the people of Ostermark, they are said to be, with all these kind of mixings of the bloodlines, but they've resulted in becoming quite a stout and hardy people, said to be quite thick-set, with eyes often revealing their Eastern Ungol heritage. And because of the placement of Ostermark, the land itself is often kind of an avenue that conquering armies tend to go through. Thus, they are no strangers to raids, to invading armies, to really anything that can bring a death to their people in any way, shape, or form. In fact, death is so familiar to them that they even have certain names for bodies around that they find. The most common of these is a planker, which is a body that's found floating in the river. So if you say, "Oh, I've seen a planker today," everyone will know that you mean a floating dead body in the river. This kind of close association with deaths has given Ostermarkers kind of a weird relationship with death itself. They have what is described as a theatrical obsession with death. And the widows of Ostermark soldiers tend to grieve more openly and more theatrically than any other around the empire. In fact, some veterans have been known to comment that they wish their wives would grieve wildly as the Ostermark widows do for them. And that would be a sight to behold. Often, Ostermark widows, often known as crow's wives, or she who wed at night, as another term for widows, seldom remarry. It's because it's said that any decent Ostermarker man would surely return from the dead were he to see his wife remarried to another man. Now, due to their proximity with Sylvania, I'm sure many Ostermarker husbands who have been in war have risen from the dead and maybe even returned to their old villages to feast on their wives and whoever happens to be in bed with them. But that's kind of maybe more of a coincidence than them intentionally doing it by their own free will. But that's kind of the idea of why Ostermarker wives tend not to remarry. Plus that they like to kind of wallow in this grief, of course, as well. Don't not say like, but are maybe expected to wallow in this grief as well. The term she who weds at night, as another term for widows, actually comes from the idea that the god Mor, who's the empire's god for death, allows widows to be visited by husbands in their dreams, and rather than just the dream of their dead husband, it's the idea that the god Mor is allowing them to have some time together, thus the title she who weds at night thrown in for the term widows. Now this kind of obsession or theatricality of death in Ostermark is translated across to some of the aspects of the funeral as well, and it's said that the Ostermarker coffins are very elaborately decorated. Now one could interpret that as elaborately decorated as some of these coffins as seen in Vienna, or one could take it to the extreme, which I like to, of the coffins one can now see in Ghana, of the coffins of fish and chili peppers and eagles and mobile phones. Check it out, Google it if you want an interesting look. Ghana coffins. And they kind of just make coffins out of what people did in life. There's hammers for workmen, fish for fishermen, stuff like that, or just stuff that people liked. So that's an interesting aspect that I thought might translate over to the Ostermarkers in some way, shape or form. Just coffins that kind of said what they did in life, were elaborately decorated, or you could take the meaning that they did the more demure Vienna thing. Who knows? I personally like the option on the right. So they have these elaborately carved coffins, and obviously the grieving widows would be throwing themselves upon the coffins, weeping loudly and openly. Very un-British of them, if you ask me. But that would be what they're doing. And so they have this what's been described as a flamboyant despair among all Ostermarkers. In terms of their gods, I've mentioned there's a close relationship with the god of death Mor in Ostermark, but they also worship Ulrich, Sigmar, Tal, and Rhea, who are kind of the gods of sunshine and nature. And they worship all the other gods in the Empire as well. In terms of their culture, as I said, Ostermarkers are very devoted to imperial culture, but it's said to have a kind of archaic tint to it. In terms of their fashion, men tend to prefer thick-set mustaches rather than the full beard seen elsewhere in the Empire. They also like tall peaked fur hats, as opposed to the floppy hat that's seen as the fashion in the Empire these days. The women of Ostermark also tend to wear their hair loose if they're single. It's kind of a sign, here I am boys, check me out. And once they're married, they tie it into a single braid that hangs out down the back of their head. On the whole, Ostermarkers are considered just kind of old-fashioned in their sense of culture and fashion itself, and you'd see kind of styles that hadn't been seen in the Empire for nary a decade, often worn in the streets of Ostermark. But on the whole, Ostermarkers are a vibrant people who have a love for life, a love for vodka, a love for horses, and a love for dancing. And they tend not to suffer fools gladly. And it's said that when a kind of dandy Reichlander tends to wander into the taverns of Ostermark and tries to seduce one of their ladies, he'll often find himself half naked in the middle of the grass plains of the veldt the next day, often left there by the lady herself, because if you think you can come in here and think Ostermark is slow off the mark and falling for your charming tricks, sir, you're in for a rude awakening. And so you'll have to find your way home from the massive grass plains of the veldt to find some clothes and get yourself back to Reichland, you silly fop. The speech of the Ostermarkers is also said to be quite unique and almost archaic in its own way. They have a unique accent that's recognized around the entirety of the Empire. They tend to round off their TH sounds to sound more like a D. And this accent makes them the butt of many jokes and impersonations. But unlike some of the other sort of Reichsspiel accents around the Empire, theirs tends to be kind of musical and has a certain enjoyable rhythm to it, it's said. They also are known to use archaic words. Much like their fashion sense, they often use language that is not been used throughout the rest of the Empire for many decades past. And they've tied this in with a number of Kislevite words as well, just due to the sheer cultural exchange that happens across that border. So, unique accented people maybe look slightly different ethnically from some of the other parts of the Empire, but still very much a significant and important part of the Empire itself. In terms of some of the more significant places around Ostermark, we will start with the capital of Mordheim. Now, Mordheim, as many of you may know, was the setting for another Games Workshop game, not just their army game, but a game with certain war bands that would fight against each other from the different races of the Warhammer world. Now, the story of Mordheim is that Mordheim was the capital of Ostermark up until around the year 1999 of the Imperial calendar, so around 500 years before the current Total War Warhammer timeline. And Mordheim was a bustling capital of a province of the Empire. It had a lot of trade going for it. But at one point, the astronomers in the Empire noticed that the comet of Sigmar was approaching, the twin-tailed comet, which is famous in a number of different bits of the lore around the Warhammer world. And they thought this was a sign that Sigmar himself was returning to the world. And the astronomers kind of predicted that Sigmar would be returning to Mordheim itself, and that's the spot that this miracle would happen once the comet passes over. So this resulted in a huge amount of pilgrimage to Mordheim, and a huge amount of people just ramming the city full. Now, after a while, with all these people kind of waiting around for this miracle, a lot more wealth and commercialism came to Mordheim, and that led to more opulence and more hedonism, and these essentially led into hedonistic cults to a certain degree, and that planted the seed for chaos to have a foothold in Mordheim. And it said it wasn't long before demons were walking the streets themselves. Come New Year's Day of the year 1999, everyone was around celebrating and expecting the miracle of Sigmar's return to happen that day. But instead, the comet slammed into Mordheim itself, destroying large portions of the town, killing untold number of people, and it's thought that this was Sigmar's judgment on a town that had given in to hedonism and been corrupted by chaos, obviously a reference to Sodom and Gomorrah. So in the ruins of the town of Mordheim now, there was lots of what would become known in the Empire as Weirdstone, what's better perhaps known as Warpstone, which is concentrated green stone of pure chaos magic, and in the right hands this can prove hugely powerful. So all the different factions of the Warhammer world started to send their agents into Mordheim, which is just a ruin at this point, but there are still survivors living in the wreckage, often survivors who have become mutated or joined cults of chaos or are up to all kinds of nefarious nonsense. But there's still all this warpstone to be collected. So the Empire was sending people in, the Undead was sending people in, Chaos was sending people in, Skaven, of course, with their love of warpstone, had people going around the sewers, rat gangs emerging and trying to pick up as much of the stone as they could. And essentially this was just gang warfare on a city scale, on a city that was unruled and deemed unrulable and just completely corrupt. So largely ignored by the Empire, which was at this time going through a civil war known as the Age of the Three Emperors. So not a centralized empire that could easily deal with this problem. So for the most part, this was just an ignored problem, and people just set this aside and let the gangs fight it out amongst themselves in Mordheim. This situation was to last a couple of centuries, up until the Great Chaos Invasion, where what would become known as Magnus Tobias started to put together an army to fight against the Chaos Invasion that had already marched into Kislev. He started out at Nuln, put his army together, fought off all the Chaos cults that were erupted in Nuln, marched his army north, united the Empire, defeated Chaos, and on his march back down south, back to kind of Nuln and Altdorf, he said, let's get rid of this Mordheim situation once and for all, ordered his troops to burn the city to the ground, or at least what remained of it, what the meteor hadn't destroyed, burn the city to the ground, and get rid of this corruption, this sore on the face of the Empire forever. So they kind of have burnt it to the ground, and it's not livable, and no gangs are fighting over the warpstone in there anymore, really. There's nothing really left of it, except just maybe a burnt out husk and a few maybe stone streets, but that's about it. The Deadwood's probably overtaken a lot of the area, but just due to the warpstone that's probably still left, that's what causes probably all the mutation and madness in the Deadwood itself. But for now, it's not what it once was in terms of drawing all these armies to it. They have been chased away and there's not much left. It's kind of been picked clean and burnt out at this point. But the ruins still exist within the Deadwood of Ostermark. So after Mordheim was burnt to the ground, around the year of the Imperial calendar 2200, kind of around that time, not exactly that date, but I think around then, that was Mordheim done with. But ever since the comet itself, the new capital was set up at Beckhaven. Now, Beckhaven is built on the southern bank of the upper Talabek, and really is kind of a compact city. Due to the susceptibility to Ostermark from raiders and invading armies, no one's too keen to build on the outside of the city, which results in these very tall, narrow buildings being built all over the place in Beckhaven, and they're not really structurally sound, so some of them tend to lean a little bit and often give the illusion of leaning against each other to make alleys look like caves and to really block out the sun from large parts of the streets of Beckhaven. The fact that the buildings are built of the dark wood of the Griffin Forest really does add to the kind of somber nature of the city itself. Now, Beckhaven itself is home to a number of interesting buildings. It has the largest temple to Sigmar in the eastern part of the Empire. It also has 2 highly mechanized water-powered sawmills, which were gifts from Carrick Cadrin. Now, indeed, the relationships between Ostermark and the dwarves of Carrick Cadrin is very good, and you wouldn't be surprised to see a troop of slayers join in with any Ostermarker army were they fighting a common enemy like the undead or indeed chaos from the north, and they have been known to fight together on multiple occasions. But the king of Carrick Cadrin gifted Beckhaven these 2 water-powered sawmills that chop all the wood they cut down into fine planks that can be easily transported. But it's said that often at night, a foreman or 2 has been known to be bribed by the criminal gangs of the area to make a body or 2 kind of be, let's say, sliced and disappeared through these sawmills as well. So that's kind of a grisly end to meet if you become a victim of these criminal gangs. But the most famous thing that Beckhaven is known for is the river boats that they build there, and they've become renowned throughout the Empire. And Beckhaven's boat yards are amongst the most famous, particularly for riverboats. They don't build open sea boats, but for riverboats, which really enable the flow of commercialism and trade throughout the Empire, the best ones you can find are probably made in Beckhaven. Moving south to the other town that appears on the campaign map in Ostermark for Total War Warhammer, and that is Essen. Now, Essen, you'll see, is kind of just on the edge, or if not just in the middle of the Deadwood. And so they too have been victims to rampaging monsters that appear out of the forest itself. Most recently, there was an incident where 5 mutants killed half a dozen people in the town before finally being put down themselves. And they were recognized as adventurers who'd kind of wandered into the Deadwood full of hubris not 5 days before and had returned these vile creatures, these vile mindless creatures. So the Deadwood's still very much a place you need to look to avoid. The Deadwood is ruled over by the Margrave Gotthold Schurz, and the Margrave, as I mentioned, are these people who rule the individual towns within Ostermark, but have a say in who the elector count is as well, making it that kind of miniature empire model we spoke about before. Now, Essen itself, because it has the Deadwoods to one side and the Erie Downs on the other, if you were to listen to kind of tavern tales of the town, you'd hear stories told about Essen, where it's a town where ghosts walk in the streets as commonly as people, that zombies till all their fields, and this is kind of a vast exaggeration of what's really going on. Yes, Essen has had incidents, shall we say, with undead. Due to its proximity with Sylvania to the south, there are been sort of dead undead walking through the lands, but Essen itself is actually still a relatively civilized place. To the north, we have Fortenhaft. Now, Fortenhaft is really a fortress more than a town, but it's an outpost, really, an isolated outpost in Ostermark that is really a key defensive point for the province for any invasions from the northeast, and is a key revenue generator in terms of making sure that all river trade and road trade going up to Kislev is properly taxed and provides a good source of income for the province that way. Fortenhaft is ruled over by the Margrave Conrad Rontgen, and as I said, plays an important part in defense and revenue generation. Moving back down south, near the Bleak Moors and the Veldt, we have Hevanddan, which is really sort of bang on in the middle of the province and deals with trade coming from the World's Edge Mountains, the south, and is kind of a trade hub. But it's actually even more famous for housing an annual summer horse market, where the horses who are bred and raised in the Veldt are sold to buyers from all across the Empire and beyond. In fact, it's very common to find buyers from Estalia and Tilia frequenting the famous horse market, because the knowledge of the Ungals has really been used in Ostermark to breed some of the finest horses the Empire has to offer. offer. In terms of the town's influence, it's often found itself at odds with Fortenhaft to the north over the control of large areas of the Veldt. They're the two kind of pinnacles of political power and influence over the region, and they kind of have a hostility towards one another in that regard. Never one that's been kind of open warfare or anything of that nature, but just ongoing kind of wariness of one another. And as I said, these towns are run very independently of one another unless it comes to matters of security, really. So they do have this issue of influence and control, and that about sums it up for the most significant cities and areas in Ostermark. Moving on to the Elector Count himself, we have Wolfram Hertwig. Now, Wolfram is a Elector Count known to have some martial prowess. His other title is, of course, the Chancellor of the League of Ostermark, which we explained earlier. He has his griffin, known as Bloodfeather, and, of course, the Runefang as a founding province of the Empire, the Runefang of Ostermark, which is known as Troll Cleaver. He's proved himself a worthy leader and Elector Count, but he is probably, unfortunately, most famous for a single incident known as Hertwig's Folly. And this occurred in the year about 2485 of the Imperial calendar, so around 15 years before the Total War Warhammer timeline. And what was going on in the province at this time was a greenskin invasion had come into Ostermark, and Hertwig, who was only about 12 or 13 at the time, just barely entering his teens, called together the armies of Ostermark to see off this invasion. Amongst the most notable of these warriors in Ostermark were the Knights of the Everlasting Light, who were a very famous knightly order in the Empire. Like many of the other knightly orders in the Empire, they made their name during the Crusades in Araby, and came together and amassed vast amounts of wealth and influence during that time. It's said, however, that the Knights of the Eternal Light are regarded in the Empire with a mix of sympathy and derision, and this is because they're said to be cursed. Now, this curse occurred during the Crusades, when they happened upon a town full of women and children. And this is where the logic bit kind of throws out the window, but they said they hardened themselves to the task they had to do. Now, I'm not 100% sure who ordered them to do it or why they felt they had to do this task, but they set about slaughtering all the women and children of this town. The matriarch of the town was the last to die, and with her dying breath, she cursed the knights to lead lives in heroic service but die ignominious deaths. So, mundane deaths, essentially. And at first, the Knights of the Everlasting Light laughed this off. They're like, oh, what a silly curse. And it wasn't until the kind of end of the Crusades that all the Knights of the Eternal Lights were returning home, and it said their treasure ship, with a lot of their brother knights on it, sank in the crossing. Now, the weather wasn't bad. They were the only ship that sank, and they started to think, there might be something to this curse. Over the years, evidence started to stack up that backed up the notion of this curse. Knights started to die not in glorious battle, but by falling down the stairs, choking on their food, having their stores run out when they're on campaign by a strange disease that didn't affect anyone else's in the army, by dying of strange illnesses that would only affect the brothers in the knightly order, and just untold number of calamities. When dealing death blows to enemies, their swords would break on the flimsiest of armor. It really was just one thing after another. During marches, many of their horses would be known to fall into just pits of quicksand that seemed to appear out of nowhere, or they'd drown in their armor in very shallow marshes. Just all kinds of calamities beset the Knights of the Everlasting Light, and they began to acknowledge that yes, indeed, they were cursed to die mundane and stupid deaths. This prompted the Knights of the Everlasting Light only to partake in the most grandiose of activities. So they'd have to be going on an adventurous quest or doing something great. You'll never find Knights of the Everlasting Light guarding things or being bodyguards, because that's how they die. At least that's what they think. They think, if I'm just standing around protecting a temple or something, I'm going to die. Now, the Knights of the Everlasting Light are a Templar order, and they're dedicated to the goddess Verena, who's the goddess of wisdom and justice. Now, what justice they perhaps saw in the slaughter of an entire town of women and children, I have no idea. But there you go. So they are the knights dedicated to justice and this goddess Verena, who's not unlike Athena in Greek and Roman mythology. So that's who they're dedicated to. They see themselves as cursed. But despite that, when in battle, they get the job done. They're up there with the best of the knights in the Empire, and they're based out of Ostermark. So Herdvig calls these knights to his army, and they arrive, but upon arriving, the Grand Master of the Knights of the Everlasting Light says, Herdvig, you're like a tween. You can't lead this army. Put it under my control, and we'll win a victory for you. And Herdvig, the angry tween that he was like, no, I'm the Elector Count. What the fuck do you think you're talking about? This is my army, I'll lead it. And upon that, the Grand Master just said, no, I'm not going to let my soldiers, my brothers, go into war under the commands of a boy. So he and his knights withdrew from the battle. And Herdvig, not thinking to withdraw, having lost the support of these knights, went into the battle of the Greenskins anyway. They did win, admittedly, but with heavy casualties. So heavy, in fact, that for years to come, Ostermark effectively couldn't really defend itself. They had to rely on their neighbours Ostland and Talabecland to defend them for years to come before they managed to build up their armies again. Now, the Knights of the Everlasting Light didn't stick around too long after that fight to kind of meet their punishment and move their headquarters to Altdorf soon after this incident. But the lesson from this incident was that Herdvig was blinded by his arrogance. I could also take the lesson that don't get betrayed by silly independent knightly orders, but apparently the lesson the Empire took was, oh yeah, don't be blinded by your arrogance. I think that lesson could have gone either way, if I'm honest with you, but that's the story that's the idea that most people have taken away from this tale. But it would be kind of fun to see, if you're going to put a knightly order in Ostermark, it'd be nice to see the Knights of the Everlasting Light placed there as kind of a precursor to this division between Ostermark and these knights. But yeah, that's what Wolfram has become most famous for. Despite all the deeds he's done since in defense of the Empire, people still just refer to the incident of Herdvig's folly. That about brings us to the end of our look at Ostermark, guys. I hope you enjoyed it. Do please drop a like if you did, and subscribe for more Total War Warhammer lore content. And yeah, guys, if you're interested in finding out some more about other provinces, as I said, click on the top right hand corner or check the description for a link to that playlist. And I'll put a link into the Bretonnian Dukedoms playlist as well if you want to check any of those out. As always, guys, huge thank you for watching. Special thank you to my patrons, John, Reese, and Thomas. You guys are great. Thank you very much for supporting me on Patreon. If you guys are curious about what the benefits are of Patreon, do check it out. There's a link to my Patreon page in the description and on my channel page. But as always, guys, a huge thank you to all of you who watched the video, and I look forward to catching you on the next one.